Mark Owen Jones from Durham University, speaking about social media surveillance and identity in the Bahrain Uprising. For those of you on Twitter or Facebook or other social media platforms, Mark is something of a celebrity. He was famously exposed by the Bahrain Views website in an expose entitled Mark Owen Jones, What Are You? The insinuation is that he's being funded by the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, which he would either perhaps give us some context to why he's been viewed in such light by many people in Bahrain, or at least perceived to be, because his research is extremely interesting. Mark actually grew up in Bahrain, so doing a PhD on social media and the whole Bahraini events over the past year really brings his interests together in a very unique way in some ways, so we're privileged to have him here. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks a lot, Christian. First of all, thank you, Christian, for inviting me to the LSE to talk, and thank you all for coming. I would like to take this opportunity to say that I'm definitely not funded by the Iranian government. Whether you choose to believe me or not is entirely up to you. So I'll be talking about social media surveillance and identity. And I know talking about Bahrain is always a contentious issue. So if I start looking here and it looks like I'm reading, it is because I'm reading. I'm obviously being very careful about what I say. I want to minimize any offense I might cause as well. Hopefully I won't cause any. So I'll start with a bit of background, obviously. On February the 14th, 2011, thousands of pro-democracy activists in Bahrain took to the streets to demand political and social reform. And while such an arrest is not new in Bahrain, the sheer scale was unprecedented, as was the brutality of the crackdown, which as of March 19, 2012, has resulted in the death of up to 78 people, the arrest of around 3,000 people, and the torture of dozens. And despite initial support for the pro-democracy activists amongst many factions of Bahrain's society, including people from the Sunni and Shia sects, the resulting crackdown has led to the increased polarization of the country. And now this is primarily articulated along a pro-government versus anti-government divide. And the question, are you pro or anti-government, has become both a conversation starter and inevitably a conversation stopper, depending on the answer. And indeed, the pervasiveness of this divide has not only affected relations between different communal groups, but also, unfortunately, between friends and families. So as many Bahrainis took to the streets, huge numbers of people were also turning to social media to participate in the unfolding events. And the number of Twitter users in Bahrain shot up, and hundreds of Facebook groups also materialized, the majority of which were posting updates, information, photos, and events related to the uprising. Indeed, media coverage in general of the Arab Spring tended to popularize the social media aspect of the struggle, with many news outlets focusing on the role of Twitter and Facebook in the revolutions. Much of this discourse subscribed to the sort of technological utopian position that views social media and the internet as a positive force that democratizes information, reinvigorates citizen political engagement, encourages freedom of expression, and brings people together. Some were more cynical, arguing that social media was merely a tool and not necessarily integral to the effectiveness of the revolutions as a whole. But few fully assumed the sort of technological dystopian position, which posits that technological developments such as the internet simply serve to confound the problems of space, access and interaction by alienating people from each other and even themselves. In addition to fears that technology may actually work against integration, the dystopian position describes the fear that Web 2.0 technologies, such as social media, may be used as part of the informational control continuum and thus shape media content through propaganda, psychological operations, information intervention, and strategic public diplomacy. Okay, that was working. That's a relief. But of course, one cannot reduce the complexity of social media's impact to a simple dystopian versus utopian binary. And one must acknowledge that such technologies can work as both tools of empowerment and control, emancipation and repression. The extent to which they function in either of these capacities is ambivalent and depends on a number of sort of time-based, temporal and contextual factors. In this respect, regional case studies are important in determining the use and outcomes of social media. And the impact of social media in Bahrain, for example, is different than it is in Egypt. I mean, for example, Bahrain has a totally different technological penetration rate, more people are connected to the internet, etc. But today I wish to focus on the negative potential of technology and look at how social media, including Twitter, Facebook, forums and blogs, have assisted the Bahraini government and hegemonic institutions and those representing the hegemonic order in subjugating both dissent and dissenters in the months following February the 14th. And here, by hegemony and hegemonic, I am talking of the dominant political order, which you could describe as the Al-Khalifa regime and those who are loyal to it there. And the emphasis here is on how social media may be used as a tool of surveillance, and one that can be used to discourage the performance of anti-government identities, or what Castells, or Manuel Castells, calls resistance identities. Broadly speaking, I categorize 5 methods by which hegemonic forces exert social control through social media. These are trolling, naming and shaming, offline factors, intelligence gathering, and also passive observation. And I also address the role that many Western companies, or mostly Western companies, are playing in attempting to marginalize online and offline dissent in Bahrain. And I want to conclude by discussing how these attempts to limit dissent in cyberspace mirror similar processes on the ground, which are aiming to render public spaces in Bahrain ahistorical, safe, and generic. And these processes, for example, which range from the destruction of Shia mosques to the demolition of the Pearl Roundabout, all represent attempts to limit the ability of resistant identities to flourish through the destruction of both symbols and places. Indeed, the uprising in Bahrain is also a war on symbols, one which is being fought in cyberspace and physical space in an attempt to control the population and contain how both, or control really, how both the international community and local community perceive what's actually happening in Bahrain. But firstly, however, a little bit of background, mainly about the internet in Bahrain. So I have a dry mouth, I think it's all the tea I drank on the train. So even when the internet first arrived in Bahrain, it was used by political activists as a space for resistance. Forums such as Bahrain Online were used by many to post photos of rallies, resistance, and, for example, acts of police brutality carried out by the state security apparatus. However, since the start of the protests, all of these internet forums, which are still very popular in Bahrain, and the Middle East in general, have more or less assumed either a pro or anti-government identities. So in a very real sense, Bahraini cyberspace has become segregated in terms of forums. And this segregation is not formalized, yet the nature of interactions in such forums in Bahrain is often based on political and social loyalties, and as such there is often an implicit expectation of what one should and should not say. But Twitter is different, and its functionality makes it an extremely useful and popular tool in the Arab Spring and other contexts. And the surge of users in Bahrain was generated by protests on the street. And this resulted in a proliferation of interactions online. But unlike forums, however, Twitter is not a closed community. As a result, interactions between those with opposing opinions and political allegiances are not restricted. On the contrary, they are common. In Bahrain, the resulting interactions are often characterized by volatility, hostility, and aggression. But despite these aspects, Twitter is perhaps the most effective place for Bahrainis to communicate in real time with both local and global actors who might be outside their immediate personal networks. This is especially important in light of the state's tight control of the national media, which heightened during last year's crackdown. Indeed, Al-Wasat, for example, the only national paper that was really critical of the regime, was temporarily closed down last year, and its editor, Mansour al-Jumri, charged by the General Prosecutor for publishing false information which harmed public safety and national interests. And political opposition figures have also been excluded from the state-run Bahrain TV, which last year, for example, named and shamed political activists, and even broadcast the confessions of men accused of running over 2 policemen, and killing 2 policemen, I should say. So this inability to seek representation through official media outlets inevitably increases the importance of digital spaces and social media. And this was especially apparent following the declaration of national safety law in Bahrain on the 15th of March last year, which saw the imposition of curfews and the restriction of movement. And this law was the precursor to a broader crackdown, one which saw the destruction of important political and religious structures, as well as a clampdown on public gatherings of any sort. Examples of this include the demolition of the Pearl Roundabout, which was Bahrain's Freedom Square. And some people call it Freedom Square. It's a roundabout. But, and the symbolic location, it was also the symbolic location of the uprising. In addition to this, around 53 Shia religious structures were torn down. And while the government claimed they were all illegal structures, 5 of them were proved not to be illegal. But in all cases, the government did not adhere to the correct legal proceedings in carrying out demolitions, and instead relied on the draconian national safety law, which was a carte blanche to carry out repressive measures in the name of national security. And we see that a lot of places, the Patriot Act in America, for example. And these demolitions symbolize the destruction of important representational spaces for Bahraini activists, many of whom represent the country's Shia community, a community that, despite being the majority, have long been marginalized politically and economically. Having said that, the uprising did include both Sunni and Shia, and consequently represented a major threat to the Al Khalifa regime, who are never more fearful than when both sects come together to unilaterally oppose specific policies or measures, government measures, that is. And despite the government's attempt to paint the uprising as a Shia-inspired, foreign-backed coup, the demolition of such structures, for example the mosque, seems to be indicative of sectarianism among hardliners in the loyalist camp. And this destruction and or regulating of public space illustrates an attempt to marginalize resistance and dissent. So by regulating and exercising control over these urban spaces, these physical spaces, the regime are attempting to discourage activism through the repression of activity that poses a challenge to the continuation of its existence. And the same is true of digital spaces, which are new frontiers for activism, and are the location from which people can contradict, or at least resist, the sort of homogenizing power of authoritarianism. In order to counter the threat by these digital spaces, the Bahraini government and those representing the hegemonic order are resorting to tactics to exercise control over these spaces. And these tactics are numerous, yet can generally be seen under the umbrella of surveillance. But they are all attempts to instill normative and acceptable repertoires of behavior through creating a fear of observation. In other words, surveillance is an attempt to control and regulate people's behavior by making them feel as if they are being watched. So before I go into the sort of findings, I'll just talk a bit about surveillance, and it won't get too theoretical, which is good for everyone, including myself. So surveillance itself is the process where organizations and governments observe individuals or groups of individuals. It's an asymmetric process that gives power to the observer, but not the observed. And thus is also a process by which the surveyor asserts his domination over the surveilled. The means by which an organization conducts surveillance is multifaceted, yet technological developments have facilitated the speed and effectiveness of the process, allowing for more efficient and pervasive observation. Indeed, the rise of what Castells described as the network society has given both organizations and the state unprecedented opportunities to carry out surveillance. And as Lyon argues, the information society is also the surveillance society. So firstly, the historical role of technology is perhaps most famously illustrated by Bentham's Panopticon, which I'm sure some of you have heard of. A building whose geometry allowed the observer to watch the inmates without them knowing. Mitchell describes the Panopticon as the institution in which the use of coercion and commands to control a population was replaced by the partitioning of space and the isolation of individuals and their systematic yet unseen surveillance. And Michel Foucault outlined the importance of the power differential within the context of the unseen, stating that the asymmetry of seeing without being seen is in fact the very essence of power, and the power to dominate rests on the differential possession of knowledge. So as well as stressing the importance of asymmetry, Foucault states that the major effect of the panopticon is to induce in the inmate a state of conscious and permanent visibility that assures the automatic functioning of power. So to arrange things that the surveillance is permanent in its effects, yet even if it's discontinuous in its action. So in other words, it is not just being watched that is enough to induce obedience to authority, but rather the possibility of being watched. And an example of such an apparatus, a physical apparatus, could be seen in Saddam Hussein's Iraq, where a mosque with an unusually high minaret was built in order to keep track of the Shia in Karbala. The Hassan Mosque, itself a modern-day panopticon, functioned alongside a highly repressive state intelligence apparatus, which is a common presence in the majority of Middle Eastern countries. And Bahrain is no exception. And although some argue that it is a liberal state by regional standards, or was a liberal state by regional standards, with fewer restrictions on internet access, it still suffers from many of the same repressive measures that serve to limit both dissent and political mobilization. Even before February the 14th, Bahrain has blocked websites deemed to be politically controversial and arrested on a number of occasions well-known blogger Ali Abdulrahman. So this censorship indicates the threat that new technologies pose to regimes around the world. And in order for such regimes to ensure their longevity, they must resort to new forms of observation that preferably permit coercion with minimal resort to violence, ideally. And so while such observation was traditionally carried out by the naked eye, in the case of the panopticon, for example, surveillance techniques have increasingly become embedded in technology. Gandhi and Poster argued that the growth of information technology and databases have led to an asymmetrical monitoring of behavior. And this surveillance allows particular organizations, whether they be corporate or governmental, not only to commodify the personal information of those observed, but also to use such information to inform practices of social control and discrimination. And social media such as Facebook and Twitter are therefore a potential opportunity for organizations to extract information which can be used to further the agenda of the particularly institutional body capable of collecting that data. So just as the panopticon was an attempt to dominate physical or material space through the asymmetric observation of its inmates, the modern-day neo-panopticon can be seen as an attempt at using surveillance to discourage certain forms of behavior in a wide variety of places, whether they be in malls or high streets, or on forums, or through social media. And since the essence of this surveillance is based on the fact that it's asymmetric, the restitution, or giving these technologies back to the people, or to individuals, or citizens, in order that they can observe those in authority, represents a sort of inverse panopticon, one where citizens can challenge the government's monopoly on information. This idea is described by Mann as surveillance, from the French word su, below, and veiller, meaning to watch. And so surveillance is the process of using technologies to confront organizations by documenting their actions or the consequences of their actions. So in other words, it gives those who are observed, or citizens or individuals, the power to become the observer and the power to resist the authority of the state. So Mann also discussed the seemingly mundane idea of personal surveillance, which is simply the idea of using technology or social media to document one's own day-to-day experience, just as we might use Facebook to talk about, how many cups of tea I had on the train, which I did. But a more pertinent example might be, for example, Bahraini activists who photographed themselves at the Pearl Roundabout, which, as I mentioned before, was the symbolic home of the uprising. However, even though this seems mundane, and as we shall see, this seemingly banal kind of personal surveillance can be reappropriated by the regime and its supporters and be used as part of its own surveillance apparatus. Furthermore, it is important to remember that in an increasingly polarized society, social media can be used as a tool of peer-to-peer surveillance, one where citizens use technology not to monitor their government, but each other. So on that note, it's best to probably move to the findings. Let's have some more water. So firstly, I mentioned 5 categories earlier. Trolling was the first one, so I'll talk a bit about trolling, which was traditionally in this literature is called flaming. It's basically verbal abuse, and this is very common in Bahrain. It often happens if you have a certain political opinion, regardless if it's pro-government or anti-government, you will get abuse, and it's become widespread in Bahrain. And often this involves spiteful personal comments, but it can also involve things like death threats. One Twitter user, for example, whose display picture contained a picture of her baby son, had a child threatened, and subsequently became far more cautious about tweeting anti-government rhetoric. Indeed, the trolls in Bahrain have become so notorious that many forums have published lists of what they call Baltajiyat Twitter, or Twitter thugs. This is just an example of one, a bit from a forum that published one of these lists. And many believe that such accounts are set up by the security services or even PR companies to disseminate both disinformation and give the impression that there is widespread government support. And the creation of fake accounts made to manipulate social media using fake, sort of fabricated online personas is called sock puppetry. And given that the US military have developed software that allows this, there is no reason that the private sector won't seek to profit from it. Indeed, the revelation that BGR Gabara, a British PR firm reportedly working for Bahrain, planned to organize a Twitter campaign on behalf of Kazakh children, exacerbated such concerns. because they work for the Bahrain government, they thought that this company might also be involved in creating a similar Twitter campaign. But Bahrain's Twitter trolls have acquired such a reputation that they've prompted many international journalists or activists reporting on Bahrain to write or blog about them, including Gillian York, David Goodman, and Brian Zuley. And recently, Al Jazeera reporter Greg Karlstrom, I say recently, I mean back in November, he tweeted that the Bahrain had the hardest working Twitter trolls of any country I've reported on. And Global Voices editor for the Middle East and North Africa, Amira Hussein, tweeted, she summed up the effects of what trolling can do, and she sort of said, cyberbullying equals censorship. Welcome to the new era of freedom in Bahrain. And a number of other people told me how trolling stopped them from tweeting politics, with one person stating, my heart is heavy. Even my moderate views get attacked by trolls. I'm going to take a break from Twitter. But I should add here, I'm talking about hegemonic forces here, so I'm talking about how the dominant political order use it, but obviously I'm very aware that people who troll, it happens from people who support the government and people who don't. But like I said, I'm talking about hegemonic forces, and if you want to discuss this, we can do that in the Q&A afterwards. But few people who engage in trolling have accounts that reveal their true identity. And it is precisely this anonymity that makes many people suspicious. I mean, there are literally hundreds and probably thousands of anonymous accounts, all of which have very few followers, and usually have an avatar that symbolizes their support for the regime, such as a picture of the king or the prime minister, or a Bahrain shield, or sometimes a half Bahrain shield, half Saudi shield. You can do a gallery of the different avatars. And despite the fact that the regime enjoys a certain degree of support in Bahrain, the perception that these accounts are created by the government or entities working on the government, working for the government to intimidate or bully activists is widespread. But the important thing to remember about such behaviour is that it can result in changing people's tweeting habits. It can. It doesn't always, it can. And the number of people I know have spoken, they've been less inclined to tweet anything against the regime after being trolled. Others have changed their Twitter privacy settings so that what they say isn't released to the wider public, so it doesn't really go public. And what's important about all of this is that it demonstrates how hegemonic forces can influence the flow of information coming out of Bahrain and therefore mitigate anti-government rhetoric, and thus it contributes to the state's censorship apparatus, because these anti-government messages are no longer going out to the wider public. You know, as I mentioned before, Twitter is a forum. It's a place that connects the local with global. So, for example, activists with journalists, etc. So if you can disrupt the flow of information, you know, you are succeeding to a degree in censoring. But perhaps one of the most pernicious products to come out of the uprising is the Harakum Twitter account. And Harakum, which literally means the one that burns them, is a self-proclaimed defender of Bahrain who spends his days disclosing information about traitors in Bahrain. This includes posting photos of people seen at anti-government rallies, circling their faces, disclosing their addresses, their places of work, and their phone numbers. Unfortunately, the account has achieved such notoriety that it has become common knowledge in Bahrain. And an example of his impact was revealed to me by someone who said, my friend, she left the country after her husband, who works in a bank, became a target of Harakum, and I don't think she'll ever come back. And while many have tried to unveil the identity behind this account, incidentally that just says traitors of the university, the Gulf University. So obviously the same people in that photo who would have around about are traitors. While people have tried to unveil the identity of this account, no one has been successful. And it is believed to be a number of people taking it in turns to manage the account, though again these are rumours, so no one's sure. But the account has become an institution in Bahrain itself, with people using it to both report suspected traitors. This was certainly the case last year. And also find information about traitors. One such example was provided by someone whose father used to have a high position in a Bahraini company. He was contacted by someone who had information about a potential traitor working at the company. So the person who told me this said, so this guy sends a message contribute to a climate of fear and distrust, one that is achieved through disrupting social media space by assimilating it as part of the regime's sort of panoptic apparatus. Trolling, for example, is not only a form of social control that exercises its power through intimidation, but also serves as a reminder that one's behaviour is always being watched, and that any potential dissent will never be without fear of observation. As for the name and shame campaigns, these are an even more alarming trend, and will only serve to be more detrimental if social cohesion in Bahrain is eroded further. And the Harakum is a particular worry, for it's become a quasi-official, or it certainly became a quasi-official institution, one whose continued existence and endorsement by some supporters of the regime really kind of represents tacit support of its utility as a method of social control. And indeed, the opacity which, with the regime, have so far conducted their crackdown, and the blurring of lines between law enforcement and police vigilantism has validated the suspicions of many activists who believe that accounts like Haragum actually operate with the regime's approval. Whether or not this is true is not really important. I mean, it is important, but in the context of surveillance, it's not, because in the case of surveillance, it's also the perception that is relevant. For what we perceive and what is actual, what's real, form the underlying mechanism of the panopticon, which seeks not only to make people know that they're being watched, but to believe, or at least fear they're being watched. And furthermore, the online vigilantism displayed by the accounts like Haragum is similar to the regime's use of thugs, who wear civilian clothes and work alongside the police when suppressing activities. We have this kind of blurring again of law enforcement and official law enforcement agencies and non-official law enforcement agencies. But I think perhaps one of the saddest aspects of all this is the fact that the information shared amidst a climate of optimism, such as photos of peaceful protesters at the Pearl Roundabout, are reappropriated by the likes of Haragum and reframed into a context of treachery, terrorism and betrayal. And such abuses of social media serve to remind Bahrainis of the potential costs of sharing information publicly, and as a corollary, remind them that online trust, or establishing trust, is an increasingly scarce commodity. And the nature of the breakdown of trust online was it was nowhere more evident than on Facebook. And numerous interviewees all shared stories of how they purged their friend lists through both anger at their newly developed political outlook and through fear that the person might gain access to potentially incriminating photos or information. I mean, we must remember that 44, and I think 44 students, at least from the Bahrain Polytechnic, were expelled for social media activity. Many of them were presented with evidence, i.e. printouts of their Facebook pages that showed them engaging in anti-government activity. There's a story, there was a report that one person even was expelled for liking someone's anti-government comment. So the erosion of trust itself is a crucial part of surveillance's effects, for it's the inability to trust others. For the inability to trust others promotes the increased isolation of the individual, which can sort of eviscerate social cohesion and discourage the formation of strong activist networks that potentially pose a threat to the existing regime. So finally, I mean, through trolling, naming and shaming, sort of institutional observation, intelligence gathering and offline factors, the hegemonic order are able to utilize social media in a manner that serves their interest. Specifically, it can help them preserve their longevity through extending the means by which they can conduct surveillance. And while it's hard to quantify the effectiveness of their actions, it is clear that the methods used, or at least tacitly endorsed by the regime, have generated both fear and distrust. And the incarceration of key online activists served to remind Bahrainis of the potential costs in utilizing social media for dissent, and thus asserted that the vocal criticism of the regime could result in incarceration and possibly even in torture and death, and death, of course. So intertwined in this idea of normative behaviour are invariably questions of identity. Indeed, I mean, okay, I took some stuff out about identity, but indeed, times of crisis often make identities more acute, and much of the rhetoric that surfaced in Bahrain over the past year has involved identity markers. In and out groups are used in abundance, whether we pro-Gov, anti-Gov, Sunni, Shia, traitor, patriot, all this kind of stuff. And sort of identities that engender threats to the regime's continued existence. Basically those sort of, if you look at space, if you look at online space and Twitter, for example, if there's enough, spaces take on identity just as the Pearl Roundabout takes on an identity. It becomes an important symbol of people, and then spaces become places where people can organise to come together and assert their mutual identity. And Twitter was that space, but if you can disrupt it, then you can prevent those identities from forming strongly. And if you look at Twitter and digital space as actual space, just as a physical space, then you could argue that the sort of the hegemonic order's attempts to disrupt that actually, although it's not fully effective, like I said, it's ambivalent, it's an important consideration. Anyway, that's why I didn't want to talk about identity, it gets a bit fluffy. To finish up, the tactics adopted by the regime are really an attempt to dominate space and render it conformist. And through these processes, which are both tactics of surveillance and social control, the state's presence is projected onto the Bahraini cybersphere, and certain rules of behaviour are encouraged, whilst behaviour is seen as deviant or attacked. And the desire to dominate, order, and render space non-threatening or conformist is a fundamental aspect of social control, and one that the regime are carrying out in both the physical and digital realm. While it must be emphasised that these negative effects are very real, and they are, they by no means undermine the importance of social media as a tool for empowerment, empowering people or empowering activists. It is both a tool of empowerment and control, yet the extent to which it functions either depends very much on the cultural, geopolitical, technological and temporal context in which it is being used. Even now, social media is being used far differently now than it was this time last year. So even in Bahrain you can see its role is ambivalent, and social media has been an incredibly positive force in many respects, and it still is. Yet to talk about that is really a separate issue. I wanted to focus on the sort of negative aspect. So as it stands, pro-democracy activists still face a great many obstacles when it comes to finding spaces from which to represent themselves. The brutal daily crackdowns in the villages, the destruction of the Pearl Roundabout, the demolition of mosques all represent an attempt to control space and render it ahistorical and safe. For the regime, these are all potential spaces of crisis, transformation and change, and thus a threat. So social media is no different and can also be regulated and controlled. But as for the struggle for democracy, this continues in urban space and it continues in cyberspace. But in many ways, the battle is for cyberspace as much as it's happening in cyberspace. Because it is a battle between the principles of empowerment and control, the continuation of which underlines the argument that social media, in my opinion, is both a tool of emancipation and repression. Anyway, thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. I should have said at the beginning that Mark has an excellent blog. It's on WordPress.
It is on.
What's the address? Is it Marco and
It's marcoandjones.wordpress.com.
He often takes a forensic examination of some of the issues he's been talking about today. Strangely, his blog was overlooked in the Bahrain Information Affairs Authority's inaugural social media awards last month. Your blog surprisingly didn't make the cut.
I was gutted.
I noticed a number of prominent Bahraini Twitter users won awards, including the foreign minister.
Yeah.
That
was an interesting.
Well, yes, I was going to ask you about it. So, kick off as the first question. What do you?
Well, you described exactly what happened. This was, bear in mind, this was a week before the anniversary of February the 14th. So the Informational Affairs Authority basically organised the social media awards, and what they did was give out awards for those. They had specific categories, and they awarded certain people the prizes for best. For example, there was a category for most distinguished expat, which I didn't win, but it was interesting because I was following this carefully because I'm obviously studying social media, and in that case it was given to someone whose identity isn't clear on Twitter, but whose obviously rhetoric is very much in par with what the government would want people to believe. And this distinguished expat was given an award despite the fact that they insult people on Twitter, they troll people, they also engage in sort of propagating conspiracy theories. There was one about Nabil Rajab, who's a human rights activist. He was apparently the one who sent his minions to cut off the fingers of an Englishman who had fallen asleep in a car in a Bahraini village. But he tweeted that and he got most distinguished expat. But they also gave themselves an award, which seems a bit ridiculous. So, and they gave the Ministry of the Interior award, but that was just for being most active government account, so which is vague in itself. But I mean, the whole point of it, obviously, this was a week before the anniversary of February the 14th. So they were expecting, obviously, a media onslaught. So what they were doing, obviously, was conferring or attempting to confer legitimacy and credibility onto these accounts by giving them awards. I'm not sure really the benefit of it, because I'm sure that people who find those awards credible generally would be people who already follow these accounts and believe them. But the interesting thing about the expat award, again, was that it was an anonymous account. So to give legitimacy and credibility to an anonymous account is kind of disturbing. You know, it's like saying this guy is great, but we don't know who he is.
Who is the account?
Lex Burge.
And
That could be wrong.
The full name, as in
No.
when you say anonymous, do you mean there's no human attachment?
No human attachment. So there's no identifiable photograph, and there's no name. It's just Lex Burge, and it says an expat living in Bahrain, sick of the lies, something like that. Sick of media lies. But even if it was a real photo, that means nothing. I mean, as we saw from Lillian Khalil, that was not her. And there's a number of photos that people use that you can trace back using a reverse image search that go to stock images. They're not the people who they say to be. You know, it's very easy to pretend you're someone you're not online, which is dangerous. But, sorry, yes.